Hi, I'm Ray, and this is my fourth quarter history project. And today we are going to talk about the Cold War. The Cold War is called cold because it supposedly never heated up into actual armed conflict, which means, it wasn't a war. But to be fair, the Cold War did involve quite a lot of actual wars, from Korea to Afghanistan, as the world's two superpowers, the United States and the USSR, sought ideological influence throughout the world. So perhaps it's best to think of the Cold War as an era, lasting roughly from 1945 to 1991. The Cold War gave us great spy novels, independence movements, an arms race, cool movies, and the evilest mustache in history. But it also gave us a growing awareness that the greatest existential threat to human beings is ourselves. It changed the way we imagine the world and humanity's role in it. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, William Faulkner famously said, "Our tragedy today is a general and universal fear so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There is only the question, when will I be blown up?" So today we're going to look at how that came to be the dominant question of human existence, and whether we can ever get past it. So here are the key terms that are important in this chapter. Please look through them, and do not ask questions because I will not be able to answer them. So after World War II, the US and the USSR were the only two nations with any power left, and were later on known as superpowers. The United States was a lot stronger, we had atomic weapons for starters, and also the Soviets lost 20 million people in the war, and they were led by a sociopathic, mustachioed Joseph Stalin. But after defeating Germany, the countries began having conflicting ideologies, which led to quite the rivalry between the two superpowers. The United States had its worries. They needed a strong, free market-oriented Europe, and to a lesser extent, Asia, so that all the goods that they were making could find happy homes. The Soviets, meanwhile, were concerned with something much more immediate, a powerful Germany invading them. Again. At the end of World War II, the USSR encouraged the creation of pro-communist governments in Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland, with the help of its Red Army, which is a relatively easy thing to encourage, because those nations were occupied by Soviet troops. The idea for the Soviets was to create a communist buffer between them and Germany, but to the US it looked like communism might just keep expanding, and that would be really bad for them, because who would buy all of their sweet industrial goods? As the Red Army pushed German forces out of Eastern Europe, it left behind occupying forces. Roosevelt and Churchill rejected Stalin's view, making him promise free elections in Eastern Europe. Stalin, however, ignored that pledge and began expanding his communist clutches through destroying rival parties and assassinating democratic leaders. The Soviets created a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, dominating the countries where the Red Army had pushed back the Nazis, which is why Winston Churchill famously said in 1946 that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. This resulted in Europe being split in two, with Western democracies and Eastern communist countries. So America responded to the Soviet Union with the policy of containment, as introduced in diplomat George F. Kennan's famous long telegram. Communism could stay where it was, but it wasn't allowed to spread. As a government report from 1950 put it, the goals of containment were 1. Block further expansion of Soviet power. 2. Expose the falsities of Soviet pretensions. 3. Induce a retraction of the Kremlin's control and influence. And 4. In general, foster the seeds of destruction within the Soviet system. Harry Truman, who became United States President in 1945, was a big fan of containment, and the first real test of it came in Greece and Turkey in 1947. This was a very strategically valuable region because it was just near the Middle East, and I don't know if you noticed this, but the United States has been just a smidge interested in the Middle East the last several decades, because of oil, glorious oil. Right, so Truman announced the so-called Truman Doctrine, because why not name a doctrine after yourself? In which he pledged to support, quote, freedom-loving peoples against communist threats. Which is fine and all, but who will protect us against peoples, the pluralization of an already plural noun? Anyway, the United States eventually sent $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey, and we were off to the Cold War races. The Truman Doctrine created the language through which Americans would view the world, with America as free and communists as tyrannical. And the containment policy and the Truman Doctrine also laid the foundations for a military buildup, an arms race, which would become a key feature of the Cold War. But it wasn't all about the military, at least at first. Like, the Marshall Plan was first introduced at Harvard's commencement address in 1947 by, get this, George Marshall. The Marshall Plan was a response to economic chaos in Europe brought on by a particularly harsh winter that strengthened support for communism in France and Italy. The plan sought to use US aid to combat the economic instability that provided fertile fields for communism. As Marshall said, "Our policy is not directed against any country or doctrine against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." Basically, it was a new deal for Europe, and it worked. Western Europe was rebuilt so that by 1950, production levels in industry had eclipsed pre-war levels. The Soviets saw these efforts as the US trying to expand its markets. which, by the way, is exactly what they were doing. Meanwhile, Germany was experiencing its first Berlin crisis. At the end of the war, Germany was divided into East and West, and even though the capital, Berlin, was entirely in the East, it was also divided into East and West. This meant that West Berlin was dependent on shipments of goods from West Germany through East Germany. And then, in 1948, Stalin cut off all roads to West Berlin. So, the Americans responded with an 11-month-long airlift of supplies, which eventually led to Stalin lifting the blockade in 1948. The Berlin Wall wasn't built until 1961, but 1945 did see Germany officially split into two nations. In the same year, NATO was established, which included the United States, Canada, and 10 other countries. Members pledged to help one another if any of them were attacked. The Soviet Union later on responded with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, which included said nation and 7 satellite states in Eastern Europe. However, the purpose of this agreement was to keep the satellites in order. Propaganda was used to prevent the spread of communism, as it was terrifying, especially to the United States. Like, national security agencies pushed Hollywood to produce anti-communist movies, like The Red Menace, which scared people. And the CIA funded magazines, news broadcasts, concerts, art exhibitions that gave examples of American freedom. The Soviet Union also responded with their own forms of propaganda, claiming that American capitalism was greedy and selfish. As mentioned before, Berlin was chopped up into East and West, with the West being controlled by democratic countries and with the East being controlled by the Soviet Union. After failing to cut off West Berlin, the Soviet Union tried again in 1961, and this time they were much more successful, building a wall around West Berlin, later on known as the Berlin Wall. Probably the most important part of the Cold War that people just don't remember these days is the nuclear arms race. Both sides developed nuclear arsenals, the Soviets initially with the spies who stole American secrets. The two superpowers also took part in a space race, with the Soviet Union launching Sputnik, the first satellite into space. Eventually the nuclear arsenals were so big that the US and USSR agreed on a strategy appropriately called MAD, which stood for Mutually Assured Destruction. Nuclear weapons were, and still are, capable of destroying humanity many times over. And not just nuclear weapons, the United States was developing the hydrogen bomb, which had even greater capability of destruction than the nuclear warheads. As a result, it was clear consensus that nuclear warfare would end up destroying the entire world, and world leaders did not want that. Thankfully, the two nations met and grudgingly made a few agreements. As a result, the two nations entered an era of détente, a relaxation of tensions. Let us thank the French for this fancy word. However, this fancy word ceased to be when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Apart from the two superpowers, Eurasian countries including China, Britain, and France agreed not to develop nuclear weapons and cooperate in the peaceful use of nuclear energy, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed by a dozen of countries. The Cold War eventually spread out to cover the entire world. In fact, every part of the globe was involved in some way, with the planet divided into 3 worlds. The first world was the United States, Western Europe, and any place that embraced capitalism and a more or less democratic government. The second world was the Soviet Union and its satellites, mostly Warsaw Pact nations, China and Cuba. The third world was everyone else, and we don't use this term anymore because it lumps together a hugely diverse range of countries. The United States had alliances all over the world, with NATO and the newly established Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and also countries such as Korea and Japan. The Soviet Union also had new alliances, such as the newly independent nations in Africa and Asia. This resulted in the Cold War having actual wars. It was like a game of chess, and the two sides used their chess pieces without technically being in wars. Political shifts around the world added to Cold War tensions. When communist forces won control of mainland China in 1949, the United States feared that a tide of communism would sweep around the world. During this period, European colonies in Africa and Asia battled for independence. Liberation leaders and guerrillas frequently sought help from one or the other Cold War power. On certain occasions, this led to plenty of hot wars in the Cold War. The Korean War saw lots of fighting between communists and capitalists, as did the Vietnam War. But it wasn't just Asia. The United States had its concern in Latin America too. In Nicaragua, the United States supported rebels to overthrow the leftist government. In El Salvador, the US bolstered authoritarian regimes that were threatened by left-wing guerrillas. The United States ended up supporting a lot of awful governments, like the one in Guatemala, which held onto power through the use of death squads. Frankly, all our attempts to stabilize governments in Latin America led to some very unstable Latin American governments, and quite a lot of violence. One of the countries that the US was especially worried about was Cuba, which was just 90 miles away from Florida. And the concern came from one man, Fidel Castro. At a mere age of 26, he led an army and successfully overthrew the Cuban dictatorship, and converted his country into a communist one. In the beginning, all the citizens welcomed his arrival, as he gave land to the peasants and nationalized foreign-owned businesses. But as almost all dictators do, he later on imposed harsh authoritarian rule and silenced critics by jailing or killing them. Many Cubans fled to the United States for help. For Castro, they were seen as exiles and traitors to the nation. United States President John F. Kennedy attempted to enforce containment by gathering the exiles from Cuba and launching the Bay of Pigs attack in 1961. The attack was quite a disastrous failure, and Castro became closer to the Soviet Union. And thus began one of the few times that the world nearly erupted into nuclear warfare. In 1962, the United States imposed a trade embargo on Cuba, in which Castro responded by allowing the Soviets to build missiles in his country. The United States were outraged by this news, and demanded the removal of the missiles. Tension grew in these 2 weeks, and finally, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev backed down. The Soviet Union also won an agreement which stated that the United States could not invade Cuba. The US had missiles stationed in Turkey, which is proximal to the USSR. So there was basically a Turkish missile crisis as well. And when Khrushchev withdrew missiles from Cuba, Kennedy withdrew missiles from Turkey. Let's backtrack a little bit and zoom in on the two main superpowers during the Cold War. In the Soviet Union, the government controlled most aspects of public life. Communists valued obedience, discipline, and economic security. They sought to spread their communist ideology, or value systems and beliefs. They also spread a command economy, in which the government makes most economic decisions, and the means of production are determined by a huge bureaucracy. Most land was owned by the government, but agriculture was rather unproductive because workers had lifetime job security. They had little incentive to produce better quality goods. After Stalin passed away in March of 1953, Nikita Khrushchev succeeded him. He was the same person who backed down during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Even though he still supported communism, Nikita was not a huge fan of Stalin. He denounced Stalin's actions by closing prison camps and easing censorship that Stalin imposed. He called for a peaceful coexistence with the West. However, the USSR received another aggressive leader after Nikita's death. Leonid Brezhnev was known to arrest dissidents, and censorship was once again prominent within the country. Despite the risks of criticizing the government under Brezhnev, some of the citizens still dared to do so. Usually they were persecuted or sent to jail, just like the two men here. However, they inspired other people to resist communist repression and demand greater freedom, and eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union decades later. The Cold War was not just a military rivalry. It was also a competition between two contrasting economic and political value systems. While communist countries had command economies, capitalist countries had market economies. In the latter, producers and consumers make economic decisions. Prices are based on supply and demand in a free market. By deciding what to buy, consumers ultimately decide which products are produced. The United States does have a mixed economy, however, as the government plays a role in the economy as well, but it considers itself a staunchly capitalist nation, as evident by the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. In the United States, suspicion rose as citizens believed that their neighbors may be communists. As a result, the House Un-American Activities Committee led a campaign to identify supposed communist sympathizers. Joseph McCarthy accused innocent citizens of harboring communist sympathies. He was later on condemned by the Senate, but the damage had been done. He ruined thousands of American careers. The fear of a nuclear war also affected American citizens. Some families built fallout shelters, where they could hide in the event of a nuclear bomb. Students were taught to duck under their desks in the event of a nuclear attack, because school desks are super good at repelling radiation. But just 30 years later, it's hard to believe that the world was once dominated by two superpowers held in check by mutually assured destruction. What's really amazing to me, though, is that until the late 1980s, it felt like the Cold War was gonna go on forever. Time seems to slow as it approaches us, and living in the post-Cold War nuclear age, we should remember that the past feels distant, even when it's near, and the future seems assured, even though it isn't. Thanks for watching.